1,154. That is the number of German U-boats that went to war between 1939 and 1945. Of those, 783 were lost in combat, sunk, sent to the bottom of the ocean, taking 30,000 men with them. Now, close your eyes. Picture how they were sunk. What do you see? You see this, the destroyer, the Greyhound of the Atlantic. You picture the epic duel, the ship versus the sub, the sonar pinging, the call, fire, the massive explosions of water. It's the story we've been told in 100 movies. It's also a lie. Not a complete lie, but a massive distortion. The destroyer, the surface warship, was not the U-boat's greatest killer, not even close. The weapon that actually broke the U-boat fleet, the weapon that 90% of U-boat captains truly feared, the weapon that accounted for the vast majority of kills, wasn't a warship at all. It was this. The airplane. This is the story of how the Battle of the Atlantic, a battle we think was won by sailors, was actually won by pilots. This is the secret of how air power, invisible, relentless, and terrifying, became the real hunter and the real killer of the German U-boat. To understand why the airplane won, you first have to understand why the destroyer was failing. By 1942, the war was being lost. The Wolfpacks of German U-boats were strangling Great Britain. They were sinking ships faster than the Allies could build them. The destroyers were defensive. They were reactive. They would huddle around a convoy, 50 merchant ships in a giant, slow-moving box, and just wait to be hit. They were blind. Their sonar, ASDIC, was a ping-and-listen tool. It was useful for attacking a U-boat you already knew was there, but it was useless for finding one 10 miles away in a storm. And here is the U-boat's greatest secret. It wasn't a submarine. It was a torpedo boat that could dive. It spent 90% of its time on the surface, where its diesel engines made it faster than the destroyers. It would race ahead, get in position, and attack at night on the surface, then slip away. The destroyers were playing a losing game of hide-and-seek in the dark across an ocean the size of a planet. And the U-boats had a sanctuary. They called it the Black Pit, a 600-mile wide gap in the mid-Atlantic. It was too far for planes flying from America, too far for planes flying from England. In this pit, there was no air cover. The U-boats could surface in broad daylight, recharge their batteries, and form their Wolfpacks with total impunity. The destroyers were alone. They were blind, and they were losing. The war would not be won by a better ship. It would be won by closing the pit. The first solutions were not glorious. They were desperate. The British, realizing the core problem, did something that looked like insanity. They took merchant ships, bolted a tiny flat deck onto them, and put these on top. The ferry Swordfish, a string bag, pilots called it. Its top speed was 130 miles per hour. A U-boat on the surface could almost outrun it. It was a joke. Until it wasn't. Because the moment a U-boat captain saw this rickety, slow, ancient biplane, he had to do one thing. He had to dive. And the moment a U-boat dives, the entire game changes. On the surface, he is the hunter. He is fast. He controls the battle. Underwater, he is the prey. He is slow. His electric motors can only last a few hours. He is blind. He can no longer talk to his Wolfpack. He can no longer see the convoy. This was the great discovery. The mere presence of an airplane, any airplane, even a string-bag biplane, robbed the U-boat of its single greatest weapon, the surface. The merchant aircraft carriers, or MAC ships, were a revolution. They proved the concept. But they were still slow, they were still defensive. The Allies didn't just want to scare the U-boats, they wanted to kill them. And to do that, they needed a bigger, faster, longer-legged bird of prey. This is the consolidated B-24 Liberator. It was, by all accounts, An ugly airplane. Pilots hated flying it. It was heavy, stiff, and notoriously difficult. Its long, thin Davis wing gave it the nickname the Flying Boxcar. In the strategic bombing campaign over Germany, it was the B-17's less glamorous, less loved cousin. It was a failure as a high-altitude bomber. But that long, efficient Davis wing, the very thing that made it awkward, gave it one accidental gift: a staggering, unbelievable range. The RAF's Coastal Command took one look at that range and had a eureka moment. They pulled the Liberators from the bomber stream, they stripped out the heavy armor, they stripped out the power turrets, they crammed every spare inch with fuel tanks. They created the VLR, Very Long Range Liberator. And, just like that, the Black Pit was closed. There was no more sanctuary. There was no more gap. There was nowhere on the entire North Atlantic that a U-boat could surface without being seen. The U-boat captains who once ruled this patch of ocean were now trapped. They called the Liberator Der Fliegende Teufel, the Flying Devil. But being seen was only the first half of the equation. Now came the kill. A B-24 Liberator is just a bus unless it can find and kill a U-boat. And this is where technology created a holy trinity of death that the Germans could not counter. The first weapon was radar. But not just any radar. The Germans knew about radar. They had a detector, the Mettox, that would buzz a warning, letting the U-boat dive before the plane got close. So, the Allies cheated. The Mettox could only detect old 1.5-meter radar. So Allied scientists, in total secrecy, invented microwave radar, a 10-centimeter wavelength beam that was completely invisible to the German detectors. A U-boat captain would be on his bridge at 2 a.m., his Mettox detector silent. He would feel completely safe. But on a green glowing screen 20 miles away, a VLR Liberator saw him. The second weapon was the Leigh Light, a massive searchlight mounted on the wing of a B-24. The radar could get the plane close, but you can't drop a depth charge on a blip. You have to see it. So, at 1 mile out, the radar operator would guide the pilot and then flick a switch. It was the sun. A blinding, terrifying sun appearing from nowhere in the middle of the night. The German crew, totally blind, would panic as the B-24, now perfectly illuminated, would roll in for the kill. And the third weapon was the kill itself. The new shallow water depth charges. The U-boat's only defense was to dive, but the new charges were set to explode at just 25 feet, the exact depth a crash-diving U-boat would be at 30 seconds after being lit up. It was a perfect, inescapable trap. Radar to find them, the light to blind them, the charges to kill them. The U-boats were now trapped. They couldn't transmit because Huff Duff would hear them. They couldn't surface at night because microwave radar would see them. They couldn't hide in the Black Pit because VLR aircraft could reach them. The Allies now had all the pieces. It was time to stop defending and start attacking. It was time to form the Hunter-Killer Group. This is the other part of the air power secret, the Jeep carrier. This allowed the Allies to bring a mobile airfield to the U-boats. The system was now complete. A Hunter-Killer Group made of a small carrier and its destroyer screen would actively leave the convoy. They would get a Huff Duff radio intercept bearing, race to that spot, and launch their own planes, Avengers and Wildcats. The U-boat is now royally screwed. If he stays on the surface, the planes will rocket him. If he dives, the planes will drop sonar buoys and guide the destroyers right on top of him. He cannot transmit, he cannot surface, he cannot run. The result was Black May. In that single month, May 1943, the full integrated system, HFDF, VLR aircraft, microwave radar, and Hunter-Killer groups was unleashed. The result? Karl Donitz lost 41 U-boats in 1 month. It was a rate of loss that was not just unsustainable, it was suicidal. The Wolfpacks were being annihilated.
On May 24, 1943, a stunned Admiral Donitz broadcast a single, desperate message to his entire U-boat fleet: cease operations. Withdraw from the North Atlantic. The battle was over, and it was over because of air power.
So what about that 90%? Is it true? Let's look at the final, secret numbers. Of the 783 U-boats sunk in combat, 205 were sunk by ships alone, 175 were sunk by joint ship and air attacks, and 403, over half, were sunk by air power alone. The airplane was the single greatest U-boat killer of the war. But even that doesn't tell the whole story. Of those 205 U-boats sunk by ships, how did the ship find them? In the majority of cases, the destroyer was called in by an airplane that had spotted the U-boat and was circling it like a hawk. The plane was the hunter. The destroyer was the executioner. So was it 90%? No. But to the U-boat captain, it felt like it. By 1944, the threat of air power was so total, so complete, that 90% of their time was spent hiding from the sky. They were forced to stay underwater, where they were slow and blind. They were forced to abandon the Wolfpack. The airplane turned the U-boat from a hunter into prey. We remember the destroyers as the heroes of the Atlantic, and they were heroes. But the weapon that actually won the Battle of the Atlantic was the one that came from above.